The DNA test results trembled in my hands as I stood outside my father's mansion, the same mansion I had been forbidden to enter for 23 years. The paper showed a 99.99% match. I was his son. His only biological child. But for my entire life, Richard Thornton, the man who had everything, had looked at me with disgust and said, I was not his blood. He had denied me, rejected me, and thrown my mother and me out into the streets when I was just 3 years old. He said I was the product of my mother's affair, a bastard child who did not deserve his name or his fortune. My mother had died 5 years ago, still carrying the shame he had branded her with, still whispering with her last breath that I was his son, that she had never betrayed him. I had not believed her. How could I, when the man himself had rejected me so completely? But then Paul showed up. Paul, with his perfect smile and expensive suits, claiming to be Richard's son from a brief relationship. Paul, who had been welcomed into the Thornton family with open arms, given everything that should have been mine. Paul, who my father paraded around like a prize, introducing him to business partners and society elites as his heir. Something had not added up. A man who was so certain I was not his son, suddenly embracing another child without question. So I had done what any desperate man would do. I had stolen a glass Paul had drunk from at a charity event, collected my own sample, and paid for a private DNA test. The results had come back yesterday. Paul was not related to Richard Thornton at all. 0% match. He was a fraud. And if Paul was not his son, then maybe, just maybe, my mother had been telling the truth all along. So I had taken the final step. I had broken into Richard's home office and taken a hair from his brush. The results now in my hands confirmed what my heart had always known. I was Richard Thornton's son. The only question now was, how had Paul convinced my father he was his child? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? My name is James Thornton, though I had not used that last name in 23 years. After my father threw us out, my mother changed our surname to Mitchell, her maiden name. She said she wanted to erase every trace of the man who had destroyed her life. I grew up in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of town, watching my mother work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. She cleaned offices at night, waited tables during the day, and took in sewing on weekends. I watched her hands become rough and calloused. Watched the light fade from her eyes. Watched her spirit break under the weight of shame and exhaustion. She never dated again, never looked at another man. She said she had loved my father with everything she had, and his betrayal had killed something inside her. I asked her once, when I was 15, why she did not just tell him the truth, why she did not fight for a DNA test to prove I was his son. She had looked at me with such sadness and said that a man who could throw out his own child based on lies was not a man worth fighting for. She said she would rather struggle in poverty with her dignity than beg for crumbs from someone who had already decided she was worthless. I had grown up angry. Angry at my father for abandoning us. Angry at my mother for not fighting back. Angry at the world for being so unfair. But that anger had fueled me. I had studied harder than anyone else in school, worked part-time jobs from the age of 14, and earned a full scholarship to State University. I had graduated top of my class with a degree in business and finance. I had started my own consulting company at 25. And now, at 26, I was making good money. Not Thornton-level money, but enough to live comfortably and take care of myself. I had not thought about my father much in recent years. I had convinced myself I did not need him, did not need his approval or his money. I had built my own life, my own success. But then I had seen the news 6 months ago. Richard Thornton, billionaire real estate mogul, reunites with long-lost son. The photos had shown my father, now in his early 50s, standing with his arm around a young man about my age. Paul Hendricks, the article said, had reached out to Richard with proof of their connection. A brief relationship Richard had in his 20s had resulted in a son he never knew about. Paul's mother had recently passed away, and in her final days, she had told Paul the truth about his father. Richard had welcomed him immediately, the article gushed. He had embraced his son and vowed to make up for lost time. I had stared at that photo for hours. Paul looked nothing like Richard. He had dark hair while Richard was blonde. He had a narrow face while Richard had strong, angular features. But most importantly, he had my father's attention, his affection, his acceptance. Everything I had been denied. I had tried to let it go, tried to tell myself it did not matter, but the anger had come back, stronger than before. This man had thrown me away like garbage, had called my mother a liar and a cheat, had let us struggle and suffer while he lived in his mansion. And now he was playing happy family with some stranger who showed up with a convenient story. I had started digging. I had used my business connections to find out everything I could about Paul Hendricks. He had grown up in a middle-class family in another state. His mother had worked as a nurse. There were no connections to Richard Thornton. No evidence of any relationship. Paul had gone to a mediocre college, worked in sales for a few years, and had been struggling financially before, suddenly showing up claiming to be a Thornton. It had smelled like a con from the beginning. So, I had decided to prove it. And in proving Paul was a fraud, maybe I could finally get the answers I needed about my own paternity. That was when I met Kelsey. She was working as a paralegal at the law firm I had hired to help me investigate Paul. She was 24, fresh out of law school, with bright eyes and an eager attitude. She had been assigned to assist with my case, gathering documents and doing research. We had started talking during long nights at the office, poring over financial records and background checks. She had asked me why this mattered so much, why I was spending so much time and money investigating someone who was technically a stranger. I had told her the truth. I had told her about my childhood, about my mother, about the father who had rejected me. I had told her about the anger and the pain that had never really gone away. She had listened without judgment, and then she had said something that changed everything. She had said that maybe this was not about Paul at all. Maybe this was about finally getting closure. About finally knowing the truth. She had said that even if I proved Paul was a fraud, it would not change the past. But it might give me the power to change the future. She had been right. This was about more than exposing a con artist. This was about reclaiming my identity, my name, my place in the world. And maybe, just maybe, it was about making my father face what he had done. Kelsey had become more than just a paralegal helping with my case. She had become my friend, my confidant, the person who understood what I was fighting for. She had encouraged me to take the final step, to get my own DNA test done to prove once and for all whether Richard Thornton was my father. And now, standing outside his mansion with the results in my hand, I knew what I had to do. I had to confront him. I had to show him the truth. And I had to make him answer for what he had done to me and my mother. I did not go to the mansion that day. Instead, I went back to my office and made a plan. Kelsey was waiting for me, and when she saw my face, she knew immediately that the test had confirmed what we suspected. "You are his son," she said quietly. It was not a question. I nodded, still trying to process what this meant. For 23 years, I had lived with the belief that maybe, just maybe, my father had been right. Maybe my mother had cheated. Maybe I was not his child. It had been easier in some ways to accept that narrative because then his rejection had made sense. But now I knew the truth. He had thrown out his own son. He had destroyed my mother's life and mine based on nothing but paranoia and lies. Someone had convinced him I was not his, Kelsey said, sitting down across from me. Someone had lied to him back then. But who? That was the question I could not answer. My parents had divorced when I was 3. My mother had always maintained that she had been faithful, that she had never even looked at another man. But my father had been convinced otherwise. He had refused to even do a DNA test back then, had said that my mother's betrayal was obvious and he wanted nothing to do with either of us. A paternity test would have solved everything, I said bitterly. One simple test 23 years ago, and none of this would have happened. But he did not want the truth, Kelsey said. He wanted to believe the lie. Why? I asked. Why would a man choose to believe his wife cheated rather than just get proof? Kelsey was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Maybe someone wanted him to believe it. Maybe someone benefited from you being out of the picture." I had not considered that before, but it made sense. My father was a wealthy man even back then, building his real estate empire. If I was out of the way, if there was no heir, then who would inherit everything? I started digging into my father's life from that time period. I looked at his business partners, his friends, his family. And that was when I found her. Julie Thornton. My father's younger sister. I remembered Aunt Julie vaguely from my early childhood. She had been around, sometimes, always smiling, always bringing me little gifts. But after the divorce, I had never seen her again. What I discovered now was that Julie had been in significant debt 23 years ago. She had invested in a failed business venture and was on the verge of bankruptcy. But suddenly, right around the time my parents divorced, she had paid off all her debts. More than that, she had started a new company with a significant cash infusion. The money had come from my father. He had given his sister $500,000 to help her get back on her feet. And in return, what had she done? Had she been the one to plant the seeds of doubt in his mind? Had she convinced him that my mother was unfaithful, that I was not his son? If I was not the heir, then Julie's children would be next in line to inherit the Thornton fortune. It was motive. But I needed proof. I decided to approach this carefully. I could not just walk up to my father and accuse his sister of destroying my family. I needed to be strategic. So I started with Paul. I called him directly, introducing myself as James Mitchell, a business consultant interested in learning more about the Thornton family business. I said I was writing an article about Richard's success story and wanted to include the heartwarming tale of his reunion with his son. Paul had agreed to meet me for coffee, eager to talk about his newfound status. When we met, I could see immediately why my father had believed him. Paul was charming, well-spoken, and had clearly done his research. He talked about Richard's business ventures, his favorite restaurants, his hobbies. He had a story ready for everything. But when I pushed deeper, asking about specific memories from his mother's relationship with Richard, his answers became vague. He said his mother had not talked much about that time, that she had been private about her past. He said she had only told him about Richard on her deathbed, giving him a few photos and a letter as proof. "Can I see the letter?" I asked casually. Paul hesitated, then said he had given it to Richard, that it was a private family matter now. "Of course," I said, smiling. "But the photos? Do you have copies?" He had shown me 3 photos on his phone. They were pictures of a young woman with Richard, clearly from decades ago. But something was off. I could not place it at first, but then I realized the clothing and hairstyles in the photos did not quite match the time period. They were close, but not exact. "These are lovely," I said. "Your mother was beautiful." "Yes," Paul said, his smile tight. "She was." After the coffee meeting, I sent the photos to a specialist Kelsey had recommended. Within 2 days, I had my answer. The photos had been digitally altered. They were real photos of Richard from that time period, but the woman had been edited in. Paul's entire story was a fabrication. Now I had proof that Paul was a fraud. But I still did not know how this connected to my own situation. That was when Kelsey suggested we look into Julie's current relationship with Paul. It did not take long to find the connection. Julie had hired Paul 5 years ago to work in her company. They had known each other for years. And 3 months before Paul showed up claiming to be Richard's son, Julie had given him $50,000, listed as a bonus in her company's financial records. It was all coming together. Julie had orchestrated this entire thing. She had convinced my father 23 years ago that I was not his son, getting me out of the way so her own children could inherit. But then her children had disappointed her. Her son had become a drug addict, in and out of rehab. Her daughter had moved to Europe and wanted nothing to do with the family business. So Julie had found a new plan. She had created a fake heir, someone she could control, someone who would give her access to Richard's fortune while keeping up appearances. Paul was her puppet. And my father, lonely and desperate for a family connection, had fallen for it completely. Now I had to decide what to do with this information. I could expose them both, could destroy Julie and Paul in one move. But would my father even believe me? Would he listen to the son he had thrown away decades ago? Or would he think I was just bitter and making up lies to get revenge? I needed to be smart about this. I needed to approach it in a way that would make him listen, make him see the truth. And I needed to do it before Paul and Julie could dig their claws in any deeper. I spent the next 3 weeks in a fog of conflicting emotions. Every morning I woke up and looked at the DNA test results I had pinned to my wall, and every morning I felt the same crushing weight of betrayal. My father had thrown me away. Not because I was not his son, but because someone had lied to him, and he had been too proud or too stubborn to verify the truth. How different would my life have been if he had just done one simple test? My mother would not have worked herself to death. I would not have grown up in poverty, watching other kids get things I could only dream about. I would not have spent my entire childhood feeling like I was not good enough, like I was somehow defective because my own father did not want me. The anger was there, hot and constant, burning in my chest. But underneath it was something worse. Grief. I was grieving for the childhood I never had. For the father I never knew, for the relationship that had been stolen from me before I ever had a chance. Kelsey noticed I was struggling. She started showing up at my apartment with food, forcing me to eat when I forgot. She sat with me in silence when I could not find words. She listened when I needed to talk, when the anger and pain spilled out in long, rambling monologues about everything I had lost. "You are allowed to be angry," she told me one night as we sat on my balcony looking out at the city lights. "You are allowed to grieve. What was done to you was not fair. It was not right. But you cannot let it consume you." "I know," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Do you, though?" she pressed. "Because from where I am sitting, it looks like you are drowning in this. You have not worked on any of your other clients in weeks. You barely sleep. You are not taking care of yourself. She was right, but I did not know how to stop. Every time I tried to focus on something else, my mind went back to the same questions. Why had Julie done this? Had it really just been about money, or was there something deeper? Had she hated my mother that much? And my father? How could he have been so blind? How could he have thrown away his own child without even checking if the accusations were true? I started having nightmares. In them, I was 3 years old again, watching my father pack our bags and throw them out onto the street. My mother was crying, begging him to listen, to believe her. But he just stood there with his arms crossed, his face cold and unmoved, and behind him, in the shadows, I could see Julie smiling. I contacted a private investigator, someone Kelsey recommended who specialized in family cases. I gave him everything I had found and asked him to dig deeper. I needed to know exactly what had happened 23 years ago. I needed to understand how Julie had convinced my father I was not his son. The investigator, a man named Thomas who was in his 60s with tired eyes and a weathered face, told me it would take time. These old cases are tricky, he said. Memories fade. People die. Records get lost. But I will do my best. While I waited for Thomas to find answers, I had to figure out my next move with Paul. I could not let him keep playing this role, keep taking what should have been mine, but I also could not just burst into my father's life after 23 years of silence and expect him to believe me. I needed leverage. I needed Paul to confess, or I needed Julie to slip up. Kelsey suggested we set a trap. What if we approach Julie directly? She said. What if you tell her you know the truth and see how she reacts? That is risky, I said. If she warns Paul, they could both disappear. Not if we record it, Kelsey countered. Not if we get her confession on tape. It was a good plan, but it required me to face the woman who had destroyed my life. I was not sure I was ready for that, but I did not have much choice. Every day that passed was another day. Paul embedded himself deeper into my father's life. Another day my father believed the lie. So I made the call. I contacted Julie's office and set up a meeting, claiming I was interested in investing in her company. She agreed immediately, probably seeing me as just another potential source of income. The day of the meeting, I was a wreck. Kelsey came with me, posing as my business partner. We had a recording device hidden in my briefcase. Small and undetectable. Julie's office was in a sleek downtown building, all glass and steel. When we walked in, she greeted us with a wide smile, her arms outstretched. James Mitchell, she said warmly. What a pleasure to meet you. I have heard great things about your consulting work. She did not recognize me. Why would she? The last time she had seen me, I was 3 years old. And I had my mother's features more than my father's. We sat down in her conference room, and she launched into a pitch about her company, about all the wonderful opportunities for investment. I let her talk for 10 minutes, nodding politely, before I cut her off. I am not here to invest in your company, I said quietly. Julie's smile faltered. Then, why are you here? I am here because I know what you did, I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. I know you lied to Richard Thornton. 23 years ago. I know you convinced him his son was not really his son. And I know you are behind Paul Hendricks, pretending to be a Thornton. The color drained from Julie's face. She looked at Kelsey, then back at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I do not know what you are talking about, she finally managed. Yes. You do, I said. And I have proof. I pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of the financial records showing her debt 23 years ago and the payment from Richard. There were also records of her recent payment to Paul, along with the evidence that Paul's photos had been faked. Julie stared at the documents, her hands shaking. This does not prove anything, she said, but her voice was weak. It proves you had motive and opportunity, I said. And when I go to Richard with this, along with my own DNA test showing I am his biological son, what do you think he is going to believe? Julie's face went from pale to red, anger replacing fear. You, she spat. You are that brat. I should have known. So you do remember me, I said coldly. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You think you can just waltz back into Richard's life after all these years? You think he is going to welcome you with open arms? He threw you out once. He will do it again. Maybe, I said. But at least he will know the truth. And you will lose everything. Julie's face twisted with rage and something else. Desperation. You do not understand, she said. I did what I had to do. Richard was going to give everything to you, his perfect little son. My children would have gotten nothing. I was his sister. I deserved that money more than some kid. So, you destroyed my family for money, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. You let my mother be labeled a cheater. You let me grow up thinking I was not wanted, not loved. You let us struggle and suffer, all so you could get a bigger piece of his fortune. Julie sat back down, her face in her hands. I did not think it would go this far, she said quietly. I thought Richard would just divorce her and move on. I did not think he would cut you off completely. But you did not try to fix it, I said. You let it stand. You watched us suffer and you did nothing. And now you have brought Paul into this, another lie, another manipulation. What kind of person does that? Julie looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something like regret in her eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by cold calculation. What do you want? She asked. I want you to tell Richard the truth, I said. I want you to admit what you did, and I want Paul out of his life. And what do I get in return? She asked. You get to avoid criminal charges for fraud, I said. Because what you have done with Paul, that is fraud. You could go to jail. Julie was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. Then she shook her head. I will take my chances, she said. Richard will never believe you over me. I am his sister. You are just a ghost from his past. Fine, I said, standing up. Then I will see you in court. We left her office with the recording secure. Kelsey grabbed my arm as we walked to the car. That was brutal, she said. Are you okay? I do not know, I admitted. I thought confronting her would make me feel better. But I just feel empty. We got what we needed, Kelsey said. We have her on tape admitting she lied about you. We have the financial proof. We have Paul's fake documents. Richard will have to listen now. I hoped she was right. But a part of me was terrified that Julie was right too. What if my father still did not want me? What if even with all this proof, he chose to believe I was lying? What if I went through all of this and still ended up rejected? 2 days after the confrontation with Julie, everything changed. Thomas, the private investigator, called me with information that turned my entire understanding upside down. You need to sit down for this, he said, his voice grave. I sat in my office, Kelsey beside me, and put him on speaker. What did you find? I asked. I found the person who started the rumor about your mother, Thomas said. The person who told Richard that you were not his son. Who? I demanded. It was not Julie, Thomas said. She took advantage of the situation. Yes, but she was not the one who planted the original lie. Then, who was it? My grip on the phone was so tight my knuckles were white. It was Richard's business partner at the time, a man named Gregory Walsh. He told Richard that he had seen your mother with another man, that he had proof of an affair. The world seemed to tilt. Gregory Walsh? I said. Why would he do that? Thomas was quiet for a moment before continuing. Gregory and Richard were building the Thornton empire together back then. They were equal partners. But Richard was the face of the company, the one everyone loved. Gregory was in the background, doing the work but getting none of the glory. I found emails from that time period. Gregory was resentful. He felt Richard did not appreciate him. So, he what? I said slowly. Destroyed my family out of spite. Not spite, Thomas corrected. Strategy. If Richard was distracted by a messy divorce, if he was emotionally compromised, Gregory could take control of the company. And that is exactly what happened. For 5 years after your parents divorced, Gregory was making all the major decisions while Richard was barely functional. But it gets worse, Thomas continued. Gregory was also having an affair with Julie. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. What? Julie and Gregory were involved romantically, Thomas explained. I found hotel records, phone records, everything. They were together for years. And Julie knew what Gregory had done. She helped him. She backed up his story about your mother. She convinced Richard not to do a DNA test, told him it would be too painful, that he should just move on. So they were working together, Kelsey said, her voice sharp with anger, the whole time. Yes, Thomas confirmed, and here is the real twist. Gregory Walsh died 8 years ago. He had a heart attack in his office. But before he died, he wrote a letter. A letter? I asked. To whom? To Richard, Thomas said. But it was never sent. I found it in Gregory's estate papers when I was going through court records. His lawyer had kept it, probably not knowing what to do with it. What did it say? I could barely breathe. It is a confession, Thomas said. Gregory admitted everything. He admitted he lied about your mother. He admitted he manipulated Richard to gain control of the company. He said he regretted it, that the guilt had eaten at him for years. He wanted Richard to know the truth. But why did the lawyer not send it? Kelsey asked. I spoke to the lawyer, Thomas said. He told me that when Gregory died, Julie came to collect his personal effects. She went through everything, and she must have missed this one letter. The lawyer assumed it was private and kept it filed away. So Julie knows, I said slowly. She has known all along that I am Richard's son. She helped Gregory destroy my family, and even after Gregory died, she kept the secret. And then she brought in Paul, Kelsey added. She created a fake heir because she knew you were the real one, and she could not let you come back. Exactly, Thomas said. This goes deeper than we thought. This is not just about money. This is about Julie covering up decades of lies. Can you send me that letter? I asked. Already done, Thomas said. Check your email. I hung up and opened my laptop. The scanned letter was there, Gregory's handwriting shaky but legible. As I read it, I felt tears burning in my eyes. Gregory described in detail how he had fabricated evidence of my mother's affair. He had paid a man to pretend to be her lover, had staged photos, had created a whole narrative. He described how easy it had been to convince Richard, who was already stressed from work and insecure about his marriage. He wrote about how Julie had helped him, how they had planned it together, how she had convinced Richard to cut us off completely. And then, at the end of the letter, Gregory wrote something that broke me. He said he had seen my mother years later, working 3 jobs, exhausted and broken. He said he had watched her from afar and realized what he had done. He said she had been innocent all along, and he had destroyed an innocent woman's life for business gain. He said he hoped Richard could forgive him, but he understood if he could not. He said he did not deserve forgiveness. I closed the laptop and put my head in my hands. Kelsey wrapped her arms around me, and I let myself cry for the first time since this whole thing started. My mother had been telling the truth all along. She had been faithful, had loved my father, and had been destroyed by lies. And she had died never knowing that I would one day prove her innocence. I am so sorry, Kelsey whispered. I am so sorry she did not live to see this. Me too, I managed to say. Now I had everything I needed. I had my DNA test proving I was Richard's son. I had Julie's recorded confession about manipulating the current situation with Paul. And I had Gregory's letter confessing to the original lie, but I also had a new problem. How was I supposed to tell my father that his best friend and his sister had conspired to destroy his family? How was I supposed to walk back into his life and shatter everything he believed? Kelsey pulled back and looked at me. You do not have a choice, she said firmly. He deserves to know the truth. All of it. I know, I said. But what if it destroys him? Then he will have to put himself back together, Kelsey said. Just like you did. Just like your mother tried to do. You cannot protect him from the truth just because it is painful. She was right. I had spent weeks gathering evidence, building a case, preparing for this moment. Now I had to follow through. I made a decision. I would go to my father's mansion. I would bring everything with me. The DNA tests, the recording of Julie, Gregory's letter, all of it. And I would make him listen. But I would not go alone. Are you ready for this? I asked Kelsey. She nodded. I am with you. Whatever happens. I smiled, despite the fear churning in my stomach. Thank you. For everything. Do not thank me yet, she said with a small smile. We still have to actually do this. That night, I called my father's office and made an appointment. I used my business name, James Mitchell, and said I had important information regarding Paul Hendricks. His secretary scheduled me for the following afternoon. As I hung up, I realized there was no turning back now. Tomorrow, I would face the man who had thrown me away. Tomorrow, I would reveal the truth that would change everything. Tomorrow, I would finally reclaim my identity as James Thornton. I just hoped I was ready for whatever came next. The Thornton mansion looked exactly as I remembered it from my earliest memories, though everything seemed smaller now. The tall iron gates, the long driveway lined with oak trees, the fountain in the front circle. I had vague flashes of playing near that fountain as a toddler, my mother watching me with a smile. Now I was back, 23 years later, with evidence that would tear apart everything my father thought he knew. Kelsey squeezed my hand as we sat in my car outside the gates. You can do this, she said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I pressed the intercom button and announced myself. The gates swung open slowly. As we drove up to the house, I saw movement in one of the upstairs windows. Someone was watching. We parked and walked to the front door. Before I could knock, it opened. A woman in her 50s, presumably the housekeeper, greeted us with a polite smile. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Thornton is waiting for you in his study. Please follow me. We walked through the house, and I tried not to stare at everything. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the artwork on the walls. This should have been my home. This should have been where I grew up. The housekeeper led us down a hallway and knocked on a heavy wooden door. Come in, a voice called. My father's voice. I had not heard it in over 2 decades, but I recognized it instantly. We entered the study. Richard Thornton sat behind a massive desk, Reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed some documents. He looked older than in the photos I had seen online. His blonde hair was streaked with gray, and there were deep lines around his eyes and mouth. But he was still a commanding presence. He looked up as we entered, and for a moment our eyes met. I saw confusion flicker across his face, as if something about me was familiar but he could not place it. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, standing and extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." My secretary said, "You have information about my son?" I shook his hand. My heart pounding. The word son applied to Paul felt like a knife. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I have quite a bit of information actually. Please, sit." Richard gestured to the chairs across from his desk. We sat, and I placed my briefcase on my lap. "Before we begin," I said, "I need to ask you something. When Paul came to you claiming to be your son, did you do a DNA test?" Richard frowned slightly. "Of course I did. I am not a fool. The test confirmed he is my biological child." I felt my stomach drop. "That is impossible," I said. "Paul is not your son. I have proof." Richard's expression hardened. "Mr. Mitchell, I do not know what kind of game you are playing, but I did not agree to this meeting so you could insult my family." "Please hear me out," I said quickly. I pulled out the folder containing Paul's faked photos and the evidence of Julie's payments to him. I slid it across the desk. "This is Paul's background. He was hired by your sister, Julie, 5 years ago. 3 months before he contacted you, she gave him $50,000. The photos he showed you of his mother with you, they were digitally altered. I have an expert's report confirming it." Richard picked up the document slowly, his frown deepening as he read. "This does not make sense," he said. "The DNA test showed he is my son." "Unless," I said carefully, "the DNA sample he gave was not actually his." Richard looked up sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that Paul is a con artist," I said. "And I believe your sister Julie helped him fake the DNA results." "That is ridiculous," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Why would Julie do that?" I pulled out the next set of documents. These show Julie's financial situation, 23 years ago. She was drowning in debt. Then, suddenly, right after your divorce, you gave her $500,000 and she paid off everything. Richard stared at the papers. "I helped my sister when she needed it. That does not prove anything. It establishes a pattern," I said. "Julie has repeatedly benefited financially from influencing your family decisions, and there is more." I pulled out the recording device and set it on the desk. 2 days ago, I met with Julie. I told her I knew about Paul's fraud. This is what she said. I played the recording. Julie's voice filled the study, admitting that she had manipulated Richard, that Paul was her creation, that she had done what she had to do, to protect her interests. Richard's face went pale as he listened. When the recording ended, he sat back in his chair, looking like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "I need to call Paul," he said quietly. "I need to ask him directly." "Before you do that," I said, "there is something else you need to know. Something about your first marriage." Richard's eyes snapped to mine, and I saw anger flash across his face. "I did not agree to discuss my personal history with a stranger." "I am not a stranger," I said quietly. "My real name is not James Mitchell. It is James Thornton." Richard froze. "I am your son," I continued. "Your real son. The one you threw away 23 years ago because you believed my mother had an affair. But she did not. She was faithful to you. And I can prove it." I pulled out the DNA test showing the 99.99% match between Richard's DNA and mine. I slid it across the desk. "This is not possible," Richard whispered, but he picked up the paper with shaking hands. His eyes scanned the results once, twice, 3 times. "You are," he started, then stopped. "I am," I confirmed. "I am your biological son, the son you denied, the son you abandoned." Kelsey, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Mr. Thornton, there is more you need to know. About why you believe James's mother was unfaithful." I pulled out Gregory Walsh's letter. "This was written by your former business partner Gregory Walsh, before he died, 8 years ago. He never sent it, but I found it during my investigation. Read it." Richard took the letter with trembling hands. As he read, I watched his face go through a series of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally rage. He slammed the letter down on the desk. "Gregory," he said, his voice choked. "Gregory did this. He lied to me. He destroyed my family." "And Julie helped him," I said. "She backed up his lies. She convinced you not to do a DNA test back then. She kept you from ever knowing the truth. And now she has brought Paul in to keep you from discovering that your real son, me, is still alive." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair falling backward. He walked to the window, his back to us, his shoulders shaking. I sat silently, letting him process. Minutes passed. Finally, he turned back to face me, and I saw tears streaming down his face. I threw you out, he said, his voice breaking. I threw out my own son. I called your mother a liar and a cheat. I let you both suffer. And he stopped, struggling to continue. She died, did she not? Your mother. 5 years ago. I said quietly. She worked herself to death trying to provide for me. And she never stopped saying that I was your son. She never stopped defending herself against your accusations. But I did not believe her. Richard sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The strongest man in the city, the billionaire real estate mogul, was sobbing like a child. I am sorry, he said over and over. I am so sorry. I did not know what to say. I had imagined this moment so many times. In some versions, I yelled at him, made him feel the full weight of what he had done. In others, I was cold and distant, making him beg for forgiveness I would never give. But now, sitting here watching him break down, I just felt tired. Sorry does not change anything, I finally said. Sorry does not bring my mother back. Sorry does not give me back the childhood I lost. You are right, Richard said, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. You are absolutely right. Nothing, I say, can fix this. But I need you to know that if I had known the truth, if I had done that DNA test, everything would have been different. I would have fought for you. I would have kept you and your mother. Would you? I asked, and I could not keep the bitterness out of my voice, because from where I am sitting, it looks like you gave up without even trying. You chose to believe a lie because it was easier than fighting for the truth. Richard flinched as if I had struck him. You are right, he said again. I was a coward. I was weak. And I have spent 23 years living with the consequences. But so have I said, standing up. So did my mother. We paid for your weakness. We paid for your cowardice. And now you have Paul, a stranger, living the life that should have been mine. I am sending him away, Richard said immediately. Today. Right now, I do not care what it takes. Good, I said. And Julie? She is done, Richard said, his voice hard. I will deal with my sister. She will never manipulate this family again. Kelsey stood beside me. What are you going to do now? She asked me softly. I looked at Richard, this man who was my father but also a stranger. I do not know, I admitted. I came here for answers. I came here to expose the lies. I have done that. Now, I need time to figure out what comes next. Richard stood again. I understand, he said. But James, please. Give me a chance. Let me try to make this right. I cannot give you back the years we lost, but I can give you a future. You are my son. You are my heir. Everything I have built should be yours. I do not want your money, I said. I built my own life. I do not need you to rescue me. I know, Richard said. I can see that. You are strong. You are successful. You did that without me. But that does not mean we cannot move forward. That does not mean I cannot be your father now. I will think about it, I said finally. That is all I can promise. Richard nodded, accepting that. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for showing me the truth. As Kelsey and I turned to leave, Richard called out, James. I stopped and looked back. I loved your mother, he said quietly. I want you to know that. What I did, throwing you both out, it was not because I did not love her. It was because I thought she had betrayed that love. I am not saying that excuses it. But I need you to know that losing you both destroyed me. I nodded once and walked out. As we left the mansion and got back into the car, I felt something shift inside me. The anger was still there, but it was not consuming me anymore. I had faced him. I had told him the truth. And now, whatever happened next was up to both of us. The week after my confrontation with Richard was chaotic. The story broke in the media almost immediately. Billionaire Richard Thornton's real son returns after 23 years. Heir revealed as fraud in shocking family scandal. Sister's manipulation exposed. It was everywhere. Paul disappeared the same day I met with Richard. Apparently, Richard had called him to the mansion immediately after Kelsey and I left and had confronted him with all the evidence. Paul had tried to maintain his innocence at first, but when Richard threatened to have the police investigate the fake DNA results, Paul had confessed everything. He admitted that Julie had approached him with the plan. She had told him that Richard was desperate for a family connection and would be easy to manipulate. She had helped him create the fake photos, had coached him on what to say, and had arranged for a lab technician she knew to falsify the DNA test results. In exchange, Paul was supposed to give Julie access to Richard's finances and business decisions. It was fraud on a massive scale, and Paul was facing serious criminal charges. He had fled the state, but Richard's lawyers were working with authorities to track him down. As for Julie, Richard had confronted her the same evening. I was not there, but Richard told me later what had happened. He had called her to the mansion and played the recording I had given him. He had shown her Gregory's letter, and then he had asked her one question. Why? According to Richard, Julie had broken down. She had admitted everything. She had been in love with Gregory and had gone along with his plan to manipulate Richard. She had told herself it was justified because she felt Richard did not appreciate his family, that he was too focused on his perfect life with his wife and son. After Gregory died and the guilt started eating at her, she had tried to distance herself from the family. But then her own children had failed to live up to expectations, and she had panicked. She could not let Richard discover the truth about me because then she would lose everything. So she had created Paul, a controllable heir who would keep Richard distracted and satisfied. Richard had told her he was pressing charges for fraud and conspiracy. He had also told her she was no longer part of the family. He had given her 24 hours to leave the city. I did not know if she had left or not. I found I did not really care. As for me, I was trying to process everything. Richard had called me 3 times in the week since our meeting. The first time, he had told me about Paul's confession and his confrontation with Julie. The second time, he had asked if we could meet for dinner. I had said I needed more time. The third time, he had simply said he was thinking about me and hoped I was okay. I appreciated that last call more than the others. He was not pushing, was not demanding. He was just letting me know he was there. Kelsey had been my rock through all of this. She had stayed with me every night, had held me when I broke down crying, had celebrated with me when I felt moments of triumph. And somewhere along the way, I had realized something. I loved her. Not just as a friend or someone who was helping me through a hard time, but truly loved her. One evening, as we sat on my balcony, watching the sunset, I told her. I love you, I said simply. Kelsey turned to me, her eyes wide. What? I love you, I repeated. I do not know when it happened. Maybe it was when you first helped me with the investigation. Maybe it was when you stood by me through all of this craziness, but I know it now. I love you. Kelsey's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I love you too, she said. I have for a while now. We kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time in weeks, I felt genuine happiness. 2 weeks later, I agreed to have dinner with Richard. We met at a quiet restaurant, not one of his usual high-profile places. He was already there when I arrived, looking nervous. Thank you for coming, he said as I sat down. I nodded. I am not making any promises, I said. I am just here to talk. That is all I ask, Richard said. We ordered food and sat in awkward silence for a few moments. Then Richard spoke. I have been thinking a lot about what I would say to you if you agreed to see me again, he began. I have rehearsed 100 different speeches. But now that you are here, I realize that nothing I say is going to be enough. I threw you away. I abandoned you and your mother. I believed lies instead of trusting the woman I married. And because of that, you suffered, your mother suffered. There is no apology big enough for that, I know. I said quietly. So I am not going to try to apologize my way out of this, Richard continued. Instead, I want to ask what you need from me. What would help you heal from this? I thought about that for a long moment. I need you to acknowledge my mother, I finally said. I need you to publicly clear her name. She died being thought of as a cheater, as someone who destroyed her marriage. I need the world to know that was not true. Richard nodded immediately. I will do that. I am already working with a publicist to prepare a statement. It will make clear that your mother was faithful, that she was the victim of a terrible conspiracy, and that she deserves to be remembered with honor. Thank you, I said, feeling a weight lift off my chest. What else? Richard asked. I need time, I said. I need time to get to know you, to figure out if we can have a relationship. I cannot just jump into being your son after all these years. I understand, Richard said. Take all the time you need. I will be here. We talked for 2 hours that night. Richard told me about his life. About how he had struggled after the divorce, about how he had thrown himself into work to avoid the pain. He told me about the regrets he had carried, about how he had sometimes wondered if he had been wrong about my mother but had been too proud to admit it. I told him about growing up, about watching my mother work herself to exhaustion, about the anger and resentment I had carried. I told him about building my own business, about refusing to use the Thornton name even though it might have helped me. I told him about Kelsey and how she had helped me through all of this. By the end of the night, we had not solved everything. But we had made a start. Over the next few months, Richard and I slowly built a relationship. We had dinner once a week. He came to my office to see my business. I went to his company headquarters and he showed me around, introducing me to employees as his son. The media attention was intense for a while, but eventually it died down. People moved on to the next scandal. Richard kept his promise. He released a public statement clearing my mother's name, explaining what Gregory and Julie had done. He established a scholarship in her honor at the local community college, where she had once taken night classes. He even had a bench installed in the city park where she used to take me as a child, with a plaque bearing her name. Those gestures meant more to me than any amount of money could have. One day, about 6 months after our first reunion dinner, Richard asked me to come to his office. He had something he wanted to discuss. When I arrived, he had his lawyer there. "James," Richard said, "I have been working on something, and I want to run it by you." He slid a set of documents across the desk. "These are the papers to officially add you to the company as an executive vice president and to name you as my primary heir. Everything I own will be yours when I am gone." I looked at the papers but did not touch them. "Richard," I said carefully, "I appreciate this, but I do not want you to think I came back for your money." "I know you did not," Richard said. "That is exactly why I want to give it to you. You built your own life. You did not need me. But this company, this legacy, it should have been yours from the beginning. I want to give you what was stolen from you." I picked up the papers and read through them slowly. Finally, I looked up at him. "On one condition," I said. "What is that?" Richard asked. "My mother's name goes on the building," I said. "A wing of the headquarters? A foundation? Something. I want her to be remembered as part of this family's legacy." "Done," Richard said immediately. "In fact, I think we should name the charitable foundation after her. The Margaret Mitchell Foundation. How does that sound?" "It sounds perfect," I said. I signed the papers. 6 months after that, Kelsey and I got married. Richard walked me down the aisle, and when the officiant asked who gives this man to be married, Richard said with tears in his eyes, "His mother and I do." It was a small lie, since my mother was not there, but it felt right. It felt like she was finally being included in the family she had been denied. As I stood at the altar with Kelsey, looking out at the small group of friends and family, I thought about how far I had come. I had started this journey angry and hurt, desperate for revenge. But in the end, what I had found was not revenge, but something better. I had found the truth. I had cleared my mother's name. I had exposed the people who had hurt my family. And I had found my way back to the father I had lost. Was it perfect? No. Richard and I still had moments of tension, times when the past came between us. But we were working on it. We were building something new. As for Paul and Julie, they both faced legal consequences. Paul was caught trying to leave the country and was charged with fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Julie took a plea deal and received 3 years probation and was ordered to pay restitution. She left the city and I heard she moved across the country to live with a distant relative. I never saw or heard from her again. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about my mother. I wished she could have seen this. I wished she could have known that I had proven her innocence, that I had reclaimed the Thornton name, that I had found love and happiness. But in a way, I felt like she knew. I felt like she was watching, proud of the man I had become despite everything. I had started this journey as James Mitchell, the abandoned son who built his own life. I was ending it as James Thornton, the heir to a billion-dollar empire. But more importantly, I was ending it as someone who had faced his past, confronted his demons, and come out stronger on the other side. The DNA test had proven Richard was my father. But it was the journey after that proof that had taught me what family really means. It is not just about blood. It is about truth. It is about fighting for what is right. And it is about forgiving, even when forgiveness seems impossible. As I looked at Kelsey, my wife, and at Richard, my father, I realized something. My mother had given me the greatest gift she could. She had taught me to never give up, to always fight for the truth, and to build my own worth regardless of what anyone else said about me. That lesson had brought me here. And I would carry it with me for the rest of my life.